Welcome to your personalized deep dive. You've brought us Orlando Figes' Revolutionary Russia, 1891-1991, a history.
A great choice. Really gets into the thick of it.
He doesn't waste any time, right? He throws us right into the deep end with the famine of 1891.
And when we say famine, we're not talking about just a little food shortage, right? This was a full-blown crisis. It really exposed some serious vulnerabilities in the Tsarist state.
It's wild, isn't it? You'd think facing a famine like that, any government, the first thing they'd do is help their people.
Right.
But Figes points out that the Tsarist government, they were way more concerned with, controlling how it all looked than actually helping people who were starving.
Image control was everything.
Right. They were downplaying how bad it was, even accusing people who were starving of exaggerating the problem.
It's a fascinating look at the mindset back then, how important it was for the Tsarist regime to maintain this image of absolute power, to the point where they were willing to ignore, even suppress the suffering of millions.
They were living in a different reality, weren't they? Totally.
Like, out of touch doesn't even begin to describe it. And that, of course, that just throws fuel on the fire of discontent that was, already simmering in Russia.
Oh, absolutely. The famine, it was like a lightning rod. It brought all these other grievances to the surface: inequality, corruption, the whole nine yards.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Like, it was the final straw for a lot of people.
Figes argues, and I think he's spot on, that this feeling of injustice, that the system was broken, it was crucial in understanding why revolutionary sentiment really began to take hold.
Okay, so we've got this backdrop of serious unrest. But we also have to remember that Russia in the late 19th century was going through some huge changes on top of everything else.
Yeah.
It wasn't just farms and villages anymore. Right?
Oh, no. This was a time of massive change, rapid industrialization. Cities were exploding in size. It's like the whole country was trying to catch up with the rest of Europe in the blink of an eye.
And I'm guessing that all this rapid change, it didn't exactly happen smoothly, did it? Not even close. It was messy, chaotic, and it created a lot of tension. Millions of peasants were flooding into cities, desperate for work in the new factories, but it wasn't the best situation for them.
Yeah, I can imagine. These are people used to a completely different way of life.
Exactly. You've got these peasants used to the rhythms of the countryside, the seasons. Suddenly they're crammed into these crowded, dirty cities, working long hours in factories for very little pay.
Talk about a recipe for discontent.
Right. And Figes, he calls this the rise of the proletariat, basically, the industrial working class. And he argues that they become central to the revolution. It wasn't just about the peasants anymore.
So the whole social fabric of Russia was changing, and these new workers facing such brutal conditions, they were probably more open to, let's say, radical solutions.
Absolutely. They were far more receptive to the idea of overthrowing the whole system, of starting from scratch. I mean, can you blame them?
No, not really. Which brings us to the ideas that fueled the revolution. Figes talks about two main camps, the populists and the Marxists. Can you break those down for us?
Sure. The populists, they were, well, true to their name. They believed that the peasants were the key. They romanticized this idea of the peasant way of life, this simple communal existence, very egalitarian. They thought Russia could skip the whole industrial capitalism phase and jump right into a kind of socialist utopia built on these traditional peasant values.
Interesting. So where do the Marxists fit into all of this? They weren't too keen on skipping industrial capitalism, I'm guessing.
Not quite. The Marxists, they were all about the industrial working class, the proletariat. They saw the rise of the factory worker as an inevitable step towards, the ultimate goal of socialist revolution. They believed that capitalism was inherently exploitative and that it was only a matter of time before the working class rose up and overthrew it.
So two very different approaches to achieving a similar goal.
You got it. And keep in mind, this wasn't just some abstract intellectual debate. These groups weren't just sitting around in cafes, sipping tea and theorizing. They were actively competing for the hearts and minds of the Russian people.
It was a battle of ideas.
Exactly. Both sides were putting out propaganda. They were holding secret meetings, organizing demonstrations. They knew that for a revolution to succeed, they needed the people on their side. And of course, they were doing all of this under the watchful eye of the Tsarist secret police, the Okhrana.
Talk about pressure. So even holding these beliefs, even associating with these groups, that was incredibly risky business.
Oh, absolutely. You were risking arrest, imprisonment, even exile to Siberia. But the stakes were incredibly high. These people, they truly believed that they were fighting for a better future, for a more just and equitable society. They were willing to risk everything for their ideals.
It really makes you think, doesn't it, about the power of ideas and the lengths people will go to for what they believe in.
Absolutely. And, it's easy to look back and think, oh, revolution, that was bound to happen. But at the time, it was anything but certain.
Right, it's easy to forget that it wasn't some straight line to revolution.
No, not at all. It was more like, well, imagine a river. It's constantly changing course, bumping into obstacles, sometimes overflowing its banks.
And sometimes those little streams, they converge into this massive torrent that can sweep everything away in its path.
Exactly. And that's what FIGES does so well. He captures that sense of dynamism and uncertainty, that feeling that they were coming to a head, but nobody knew exactly how it would all play out.
It's like he puts you right there in the middle of it all.
And one of the things that FIGES really drives home is how resistant to change the system was under Tsar Nicholas II.
Oh, totally. Like, this was a regime that just seemed completely incapable of adapting to the reality on the ground. They were clinging to power, but the world around them, it was changing so rapidly.
It's almost like, well, have you ever seen those nature documentaries where, like, two animals get locked in a fight to the death, even though it's clear one of them's going to lose?
I know what you mean, yeah. It's like a train wreck in slow motion. You can't look away, even though you know what's coming.
Exactly. And that's what makes this period so fascinating, so compelling. You've got this incredible dynamism, all these new ideas, new social classes emerging, but at the same time, you have this oppressive regime that's just like desperately clinging to power.
You talked about the famine of 1891 being a turning point.
Hmm.
What made it so significant? I mean, obviously people were suffering, but what made it such a pivotal moment?
It was a humanitarian catastrophe, no doubt,
Yeah.
but it went way beyond that. It was like an earthquake that shook the foundations of the Tsarist regime because it exposed their utter bankruptcy, their callous disregard for their own people.
Millions starving, and they're worried about their image.
Right. And their response, it wasn't just inadequate, it was almost non-existent. They denied the problem, they blamed the victims, they just completely failed to grasp the severity of the situation.
That's wild and scary. Like, to be in that situation, your family is starving, and the people in charge, they're living on a different planet.
I know. It's almost unimaginable. In FIGES, he quotes this one official who, get this, he dismissed the famine as, and I quote, merely a temporary shortage of grain. Merely. Wow. Just wow. I could see why that would radicalize a lot of people.
It was a wake-up call because it showed them that the system, it wasn't just flawed, it was fundamentally broken. Reform, working within the system, that was a pipe dream.
The Tsar wasn't going to save them.
Exactly, and that's what gave the revolutionaries their opening. They could point to the famine, to the government's utter failure and say, see, we told you, the system is rotten to its core.
So it's like you were saying before, the famine became this rallying cry for opposition groups.
Absolutely. It was a powerful symbol of the regime's failures, and it helped to galvanize public opinion against the Tsar. And this is where it gets really interesting, because you start to see how all these different threads, all these different factors, the social unrest, the economic inequality, the political repression, they all start to come together to create this perfect storm.
Like a powder keg just waiting for a spark.
Yeah.
And the famine was that spark.
It's fascinating, because we often look back on these historical events as if they were inevitable, but in the moment, it must have felt anything but certain.
Oh, for sure. The people living through these times, they were making choices, taking risks with no guarantee of what the outcome would be. They were placing bets on the future with incredibly high stakes.
And those choices, they didn't just affect them. Those choices ended up shaping the entire 20th century. I mean, think about it. The revolution in Russia, it inspired revolutions and movements across the globe,
Yeah.
but it also, led to some really horrific totalitarian regimes.
That's the thing about history, isn't it? It's not just something that happened in the past. It's still shaping our world today.
We're still dealing with the legacy of those choices, the good and the bad. We've talked a lot about the broader social and economic forces at play, but what about the man at the top? How did Tsar Nicholas II respond to all of this? I mean, did he even see what was happening?
Well, that's the thing about Nicholas II. He was well-intentioned, I guess you could say, but he was completely out of his depth.
Like a deer in headlights.
Kind of. You have to remember, he was raised with this unshakable belief in his own divine right to rule. He genuinely believed that any challenge to his authority, it wasn't just treason, it was like sacrilege.
So basically, he was completely incapable of grasping the severity of the situation.
It's like, imagine being a peasant farmer during this time. Your livelihood is gone, your family's starving, and the Tsar, the man who literally believes he's God's chosen representative on Earth, he's more concerned with, like, upholding these ancient traditions than with actually helping his people.
It's hard to imagine that level of disconnect, you know, millions suffering, a country on the brink of collapse, and the Tsar is living in this, like this bubble of privilege and denial.
FIGES suggests that this disconnect, this gulf between the ruler and the ruled, it was a fatal flaw of the Tsarist regime.
A fatal flaw, huh? So you're saying that it wasn't just bad luck or external factors, that there was something inherently unstable about the whole system? So it was like the system itself was like programmed for self-destruction.
Pretty much. Figes argues that the Tsarist autocracy, it was just fundamentally incapable of adapting to the modern world.
Hmm.
It was too rigid, too hierarchical, too resistant to any kind of real, meaningful change.
Like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, you just can't force it.
Exactly. And the more the Tsar clung to his absolute power, the more he alienated the people he ruled. He surrounded himself with, yes men, people who told him what he wanted to hear, not what he needed to hear.
It's like nobody had the guts to tell him, hey, Your Majesty, maybe, just maybe, clinging to this outdated system isn't the best strategy.
Well, and those who did, they weren't exactly welcomed with open arms. Figes talks about how any kind of dissent, even mild criticism, it was seen as a threat to the entire social order,
So basically, if you weren't singing the Tsar's praises, you were an enemy of the state.
basically. And that kind of atmosphere, it doesn't exactly encourage open dialogue or, creative solutions to complex problems.
No, it doesn't. And it's kind of heartbreaking, isn't it? Because this wasn't just a system failing. These were real people making real choices, choices that had enormous consequences for themselves and for everyone around them.
Absolutely. And that's what makes history so compelling, right? It's not just dates and names in a textbook. It's about understanding the human element.
The why behind the what.
Right. It's about getting inside the heads of the people who lived through these events, trying to understand their motivations, their hopes, their fears.
And he's really good at that, isn't he? He's got this knack for bringing history to life.
Oh, totally. He doesn't just tell you what happened, he makes you feel it. Like, I remember this one passage where he talks about how, even in the revolution is brewing, Tsar Nicholas is obsessed with this ridiculously lavish collection of Easter eggs.
Easter eggs, like the kind you decorate.
Well, kind of. These were like Fabergé eggs, incredibly elaborate, encrusted with jewels, worth a fortune. And here he is commissioning these extravagant trinkets while his people are starving in the streets.
Oh, wow. Talking about tone deaf.
Right. And that's just one small example of the disconnect, the chasm between the ruling elite and the everyday realities of the people. It's no wonder things spiraled out of control.
It's like you can almost feel the revolution coming just from these little details. So as we wrap up our deep dive into revolutionary Russia, what are some of the key takeaways you hope listeners will walk away with?
Well, I think the biggest one is that revolutions, they're rarely inevitable. They're the result of this perfect storm of factors, social, economic, political, all coming together at just the right moment. And even then, there's no guarantee of what the outcome will be.
Right, like revolutions, they hold this promise of a better future, but they can also unleash chaos and destruction.
Exactly. And I think it's also important to remember that history, it's not just something that happened in the past. It's alive.
Yeah.
It's still shaping our world today.
We're still grappling with the legacy of those choices, the good and the bad. Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive. Thank you so much for taking us on this journey with you. Your insights have been amazing.
My pleasure. I always enjoy a good deep dive into history, especially with someone who's, as engaged as you.
It's been great having you. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into revolutionary Russia. Hopefully this has given you a new perspective on this complex and crucial period in history. And who knows, maybe it's even inspired you to do a little exploring of your own. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.